how can I say, weaving together the elements of our personality, and particularly if we try to bring certain aspects of our, to highlight certain aspects of our being, especially if we're doing it in the course of a retreat, and therefore we become extremely sensitive and extremely aware, and we will find that there are aspects of our being that seem to stand in the way of our unfoldment. Those are mainly, there are three, maybe there are more, but three trauma that stand in the way of our unfoldment. The first one is we become very aware of guilt. And secondly, we become aware of our resentment against people. And thirdly, we become aware of our inadequacies or imperfections. So, that is, of course, a good reason why the Catholic Mass, or the Mass in general, always starts with Pir Vilayat Khan, have mercy upon me. And that is also true of the practices of many other religions. Now, I'm called upon all the time, of course, to give practices to people, and the practices that I give are generally concerned with drawing their attention to a particular quality that is emerging or that needs to emerge at this moment. And sometimes I'm very impressed by the fact that somebody has a need for more strength, more power, magnetism, and so on. And I realize that there's no point in just working with increasing their, let's say, mastery, authority, sovereignty, if on the other hand they're destroying this by doing something which they make them feel weak or insecure, or that they don't feel happy about. I'm talking about guilt. Now, of course, we must be very careful in our assessment about guilt, because we tend to go by rules and regulations instead of following our own conscience. And I would say that your conscience is your own real criterion. So anyway, before one starts this work, there's work that one does in the course of a retreat when one is working with oneself in order to bring about transformation. I think in the early stages, one makes what the Sufis call an examination of conscience. Because if one doesn't, then as I say, in the course of the retreat, one keeps on being bugged by something that isn't clear inside, one doesn't feel comfortable about. So one might say that our objective is not just the awakening of consciousness, but of conscience. Now, there are clear cases where there's no doubt that one is doing something harmful, for example, torturing another person for one's own good, and need I say, deceiving people, manipulating people for what one thinks is one's good. I needn't say this. I'm sure that you all agree that would be like that. We have really good reason to have guilt, to entertain a sense of guilt. There are cases where it's not so obvious. For example, where one has harmed a person unwittingly or by neglect, and in those cases it's not quite clear, but one should be more careful, and this can go a little further, like how far is one responsible for a person who may have become dependent upon one, or let us say, made one dependence upon their dependence upon one, laying their trips on one, as one says in America. Now, it is possible they need that dependence, but on the other hand, one may be making them a psychological cripple by allowing them to become dependent upon one. And of course it is true that it's only if one has experienced that kind of independence that we were talking about this morning that one can help another to be independent too. One can release another person from their dependence upon one, and consequently free oneself from their dependence upon one. But as I say, there's a limit to that, and there are stages, there are cases where a person, like a child, for example, needs to be dependent. So there's no way in which we can, if we release them from their dependence upon us, or we wean them, let us say, we deliver them into the hard world without any protection at all. So there may be, it's very difficult there to assess exactly where the measure of our responsibility is. And this can go further still, of course, and it goes much further. It's like, we're very conscious of the problems in India. You know that Gandhi, when he was shot, said to the man who, well, he couldn't speak, but he was, his gesture, what he was saying to the man who shot him was, "Oh, please forgive me for not having convinced you of the wisdom of nonviolence." So he felt responsible. And if we carry this thought further, we will realize that if there are people starving in India and we don't do something, well, it's not just in India, in America, in Africa, everywhere. Anyway, if there are people starving or people unhappy, everybody is responsible. We can't say that it's just somebody's problem, not ours. And the same thing is true if there's a nuclear war. I'm afraid to say that each one of us bears some measure of responsibility. Singly, we cannot do anything. Together, we can. So, where the limits of responsibility are, it's very difficult to determine, but I think that ultimately there's no point at which one can say that I'm quite clear from any responsibility and so on. Now, I know that the mind has the ability to somehow justify what one is doing on the strength of whatever the arguments are. Mind is a marvelous instrument for justification, and so one is deceiving oneself. The other thing is that one tends not to want to face oneself. One has a bad enough self-image as it is. So I'm making it worse by blaming oneself, denigrating oneself further. On the other hand, I would say that if one is able to clear the ground, one can build something on it, and otherwise there's no way. And so I would say the first step is, of course, first of all, recognizing in one's own mind one's responsibility. That's facing up to it in one's own mind. If, as I said, there is responsibility. Second stage would be that one does apologize to the person that one has harmed. And that one can do, I would suggest, if all of a sudden, well, let's take this opportunity to think of the case of those people whom we have really harmed in our lives. Now just think about it for a moment. Starting with the person we've harmed the most, and then run down the list of people. There you go. So that's the first step, recognizing ourselves that we have by some action done some damage to the person. Now, the second step would be to write to the person. If you try to go and see the person, that person, well, all that anger will come up again, and probably there'll be some kind of conflict, and the person will then be insulting you, and you'll be defending yourself, and it will get even worse than you were before. But supposing you're right, that person has time to cool it. And can you imagine what it does to that person to receive a letter 20 years afterwards or 10 years afterwards from the person who has caused them not only the harm that you may have caused, or I may have caused, we may have caused, but by the resentment that ensued. Resentment is like a poison that may have made them bitter and angry and disagreeable and so on. They probably put it off on other people. So in one stroke of, I don't know what it costs, a stamp in the United States, you have maybe cured that person from terrible psychological trauma. One letter. So I really beg you to do that. So that's the second step. Third step is to, well, forgive oneself. And of course we feel we can't forgive ourselves. And the only way, of course, then is to call upon a power greater than one's own power. And that's why it's convenient to be able to call upon God to forgive one, because that's where one needs God most. As one feels one can't, well, it's too big a thing, one can't forgive oneself. Now, it's a very dangerous thing to ask something of God, because if he gives his grace, which one could almost take for granted, then you would be extremely ungracious by not accepting it. And so having asked for forgiveness, one must not keep on wallowing in guilt. Well, then don't ask it. Once you've asked it, well, then that's it. So that's freedom. That's part of freedom. Now, we'll have to follow this up a little bit further, but let's take the reverse, which is resentment. Can we ever say that we don't feel resentment for anybody? Now, maybe you might say, well, yes, I've forgiven that person. Have you really forgiven that person? I'd like to refer to a very extreme case. Dr. Kubler-Ross, whom I mentioned this morning, a wonderful lady, psychiatrist, visited a prison and asked to see the toughest guy there, who was responsible for, 8 or 9 murders. And the first question she asked him was, can you tell me something about your childhood? And he said, well, I was brought up by my stepfather, and he used to beat me to the point of blood, and then he would put vinegar on my wounds to make it worse, and then he would throw me in my room and lock me up in my room, sometimes for days without eating. And then he would spit at me when I came out, and he would say I was no good, and so on. And when I was 14, he threw me out of the house, and I found myself ganged up with a gang of no-goods who were robbing. And so then she said, well, why do you kill people? He said, well, it was, they resisted my robbing them. It was more convenient to kill them. She said, is that why you kill people? Yes, I think so. Why not? Does it occur to you that it's because of your resentment against your stepfather? I can't see that. Okay, now tell me something about do you know something about the childhood of your stepfather? Oh yes, my stepfather, yes. Well, he was brought up by his stepfather, who beat him and all the rest of it. So she said, does it occur to you then that your stepfather was acting out of resentment for his stepfather, and now you are acting out of resentment because of your stepfather? And all of a sudden he saw it. And this big, strong, rather tough guy broke down, crying, and he said, yes, I'll never do it again, I'll never do it again. purely a matter of discovering what it was that made him want to kill people. Resentment. Now that's an extreme case. Now look what's happening in India today. Poor Sikhs are being killed. They weren't responsible. Those who were being killed weren't responsible for assassinating Indira Gandhi. Resentment. That's what wars are created by. Resentment. The consulting rooms of psychologists are full of people wallowing in resentment. And it occurs to me that there is no way in which can unfold our personality if we're entertaining resentment. And it's no use preaching and saying you should forgive your fellow men. There are people who just find it really impossible. Now, I know some extreme cases of forgiveness which are very, very moving. For example, a man who was tortured twice in a concentration camp, once by the Nazis and the second time by the Russians. And in both cases he kept on forgiving the person who was torturing him. He kept on thinking to himself, oh, just imagine that person should have been brainwashed to the extent that that person wants to harm me. What a terrible thing must have happened to that person to want to harm me. And afterwards, when I spoke to him, he said, well, you see, I was concentrating on Christ, and I thought to myself, well, when Christ was being beaten by the Roman soldiers, and he was tortured, before being put on the cross, do you think that Christ was angry with him? Christ must have thought to himself, well, they don't know what they do. Well, the secret, therefore, is to get into the consciousness of the person whom one resents and see how things look from their angle. From their angle, one is somebody who needs to be tortured or needs to be punished or whatever. There's a different vantage point. So some of the methods that we're using this morning, like learning how to turn within, will help one to get into the consciousness of the person who has done one harm, and not that one will forgive that person, but one will condone. Not that one will condone their action, but that one will be able to understand how it occurred. Like, for example, the victims of that murderer, if they had known that the reason why he was doing this was because of his resentment, then they would understand, at least. My sister was beaten to death by a Nazi go-lighter during the Second World War. And the report that was given was that, well, she was hit 3 times. Both times she fell to the floor, and the third time, because they asked her, will you say Heil Hitler? And she said no. And they gave her a big hit and threw her to the floor, and then the second time and the third time, she looked in the go-lighter's eyes and said, the day will come when you will know the truth. There's no anger. There was just, she saw that they were acting out of total ignorance. Now, this is part of the path towards freedom, the way to freedom, which I was talking about this morning, being able to be free from resentment. It's something so important if you are able to do that. In fact, I'm going to ask us all, if just for a few minutes, if we can just simply think of the person who has harmed us the most. And if we can free ourselves from the resentment simply by saying, well, that person was brought up in this way of thinking, or brainwashed, or misassessed my intentions, or well, that person had a need to have horns, let's say, like a bull needs its horns, and needed, perhaps that person was in need of a sense of security, and I was the scapegoat with which that person was able to affirm themselves, whatever it is. But at least see things from the point of view of the other person. And then you let them off the hook. That is magnanimity. It's a word that's not used very frequently, to be magnanimous. That means to have room for people. The great leader, someone who's always has room for strong egos around him. Little leader, little personality, becomes a dictator, destroys strong wills around him. Big leader, where even if a person tried to destroy him, he will still welcome them. As a great leader. I remember a word of Voltaire, the French philosopher, who said, I totally disagree with what you say, but I'll give my life for your right to say it. That's magnanimity. There comes a stage in one's life when there's a stage of maturity where one is playing with the children of the world, and they will pull your hair and poke out your eyes and trip you over. But, well, they're children. That's the way they are, and so you don't reciprocate. That's maturity. And so these are the obstacles. If you remember, we're talking about the obstacles that stand in the way of our unfoldment. If you have been able to make that step in overcoming any resentment, not only overcoming resentment, that's still negative, but actually really welcoming the person who has done you the most harm, welcoming them, then I would say all the other qualities will come by themselves. That you've overcome the obstacle that's standing in the way of the unfoldment of your being. The consequence will be a lot of mastery, the consequence will be a lot of joy, the consequence will be a lot of insight, and of course, unconditional love. Now, the third one is, as I said, our sense of inadequacy that stands in the way of our unfoldment. And let's say our self-denigration. And I think that most of us suffer from an overly sense of humility. We've overdone the humility part of things. I know there are people who do the opposite, but suffer from megalomania. But I think that most nice people suffer from an overdose of humility. In any case, when you are meditating, and especially when the meditation is directed towards unfolding, let's say, the divine potentialities in your being, then what stands in the way is our sense of self-denigration, and yet we are judgmental about aspects of ourselves that we don't like. And it's amazing how these, the awareness of these aspects becomes so amazingly almost compulsive during the retreat that people, well, you see, people don't know how to overcome their defects. I'm sure we all feel the same. We have what we call defects, and we just don't know how to overcome them. much as we might try. So, not just that we can't develop the qualities we'd like to develop, we can't overcome the mistakes, the failures that we feel we have. And now for this, we have a very beautiful image in a lovely modern song, that's an old song anyway. I lay me down as a bridge over troubled waters, that the Silver Queen may reach her destination. Well, the Silver Queen is our higher self, or our soul, if you like. And that which we are laying down is our inferior nature, our monkey nature, that can be turned to good use instead of denigrating it. It has a purpose. It's a marvelous bridge which will lead our higher self to its destination. That is what in modern terms now is called self-acceptance. That is, even accepting the defects as, let's say, having been necessary in the past to serve as a bridge. Once the bridge has served its purpose, you can blow the bridge. So you don't need those defects anymore. But as far as the past is concerned, you did need them. There's the equivalent of this in India, in the Mahabharata. The Sita, the twin soul or the queen of Rama, the female counterpart of Rama, was kidnapped by Ravana, and then Rama called a whole army of monkeys, and the monkeys formed a bridge. And he was, as a matter of fact, it happens in nature. Monkeys do form a bridge, so that in other animals do that too. Ants do that too. They form a bridge, so that the hordes of ants can come across the water, and then some of them will die. So, so that he was able to recover his soul, who was Sita. And that's a story. So our monkey nature, let's say our primitive nature, has its part to play. And so instead of denigrating it ourselves because of it, we must realize that it is like the support system that enabled us to reach where we have reached now. For example, a bull without horns is a very sorry bull. It needs its horns. And so maybe in the early part of our lives we were rather timid, and so it was we lied because we're afraid of hurting people, or we thought it was easy, and so on. So now we feel that there's some dishonesty in our lives which we feel uncomfortable about. Well, okay, we don't have to use that procedure any longer, but at least maybe when we were younger we didn't have the strength to be able to pursue our purpose without resorting to something which now we don't like. Now, in many of the aesthetic schools, there's a practice which consists in prostrating and lifting one's body again. This is to be found among the Buddhists, for example, and the Tibetan Buddhists, for example, particularly if you go to Bodh Gaya, which is the place where Buddha sat under the tree for 49 days, and you can see the tree, at least it's probably the continuation of the same tree that had been grown again. I've sat there many times throughout the night meditating. And you can see the people, sometimes very old men and women, over 80 years old, prostrating with their whole body on the floor, and then standing up again, and then prostrating again throughout the night, thousands of times. If you go to some of the countries in the Middle East, you'll find people repeating the zikr, the Sufi zikr, prostrating. and then rising again. The Hezekiahs, who are the Christian fathers, Orthodox fathers of the desert, who left the church, the official church, in order to become hermits, because they were rather fed up with all the bickering about dogma. They wanted to experience the real thing. Practicing Kyrie eleison. Kyrie, it is accepting responsibility, accepting guilt, and asking for forgiveness. Now, I'd like to tell you something in relationship to this. It refers to one of the most meaningful events in the history of the world, I think, the moment when Christ was suspended on the cross, and the last words he said were, "Oh, God, why hast thou forsaken me?" These words have been commented a lot, as you know. He was referring to verses of Solomon. But let us just think about the significance of these words. Here was someone who had been carried triumphant on the Mount of Olives after his Sermon on the Mount, who'd been followed by millions who had claimed that he could destroy the temple and build it again. And here he was on the cross. Not one of his disciples had the courage to affirm that he was his disciple. He'd been abandoned on all sides. And people thought, well, now let's see if he can save himself after all his claims. And what did he say? "Oh God, why hast thou abandoned me?" And what he was doing was to prove that by his resurrection, that the greatest fiasco can turn into the greatest victory. He was giving courage to those who are forlorn and broken. His message was not that of Shiva, which is for the heroes who can overcome everything by their will and power and consciousness, but his message was for those who are broken and forlorn, which is the masses, of course. And what he was saying to them is, fiasco can aver itself to be a victory. That's what he was showing them it can be. Well, he said I could have called a militia of angels, but he wanted to prove that. Yeah, now look, supposing that it was the other way around, and that it was God speaking through the voice of Jesus and was saying to people, "Why have you abandoned me?" And so I think we have, as our conscience becomes very sharpened, we have a sense of having let our higher self down. In fact, having let the divine in us down. And so guilt goes much further than what I described a little earlier. And therefore, there is a need somehow to go through a process of surrender. You see, surrender is a very difficult thing. I mean, I would say never give up or never surrender or never give in and so on. But then we're faced sometimes with an inexorable fact. For example, the death of somebody. You know how we react by saying, "Oh, no. We refuse to accept the unacceptable." practice consists in surrendering one's lower self to one's higher purpose. Accepting it and yet surrendering it. And not in order to be transformed, but simply by the sheer need to face the reality of one's being. So there's the practice of the Herikas, as I say, is, and let us do it now, just so that we experience that moment of surrender. Kyrie eleison. Kyrie eleison. Kyrie eleison. Kyrie eleison. Kyrie eleison. Now, of course, it's very difficult to do this sitting in seats, actually, when they're supposed to do this kneeling, which is, as you see, very different from sitting cross-legged. Sitting cross-legged is the way of the yogi who is experiencing mastery and power and so on, whereas kneeling is the attitude of prayer. In sitting cross-legged, one is the center, whereas kneeling, one is not the center, it's an offset from the center, and therefore it's an attitude which is prayerful and which corresponds to this need of surrender. Going through a state of annihilation. Now, the Sufis have a very similar practice, which is Allah. Now, this is not the right time and occasion for us to do this together, but I can tell you that it's very powerful. I've done it myself for 40 days fasting, the whole day. What that does to you is quite beyond belief. I tried to understand or account for why it has such a very strong transforming effect. And one is that it certainly interrupts your, let's say, linear thinking. So there's no way of thinking by association as we generally do, passing from one thought to another, if you keep on repeating a formula like that, especially if you're prostrating. The other thing is that one goes through an experience of annihilation, and as I said before, this is borne out by the words of St. John of the Cross, and actually it's St. Francis of Assisi, who both said the same thing. To become what you are, you have to pass through a stage where you are nothing. It's part of the alchemical process. As I said, solve et coagule, solve, one goes through a stage where one is annihilated, crucified, annihilated. They call it nigredo. Now, this is something that happens to us in the normal, let's say, cycles of our existence. We pass through phases where everything breaks down. I don't know whether it's happened to you, but it might. It does happen to people. It's very strange how one, just at the same moment in one's life, one loses one's job, one's relationship breaks down, one has some kind of accident in one's house or something like that. There's been a flood, and one loses one's best friend. Everything happens at the same time. And somehow one has a sense of having been humiliated, or having crumbled, or having a kind of life becomes like a kind of catastrophe. Catastrophic. Now, this, as I say, is a natural part of the cycle of existence. The tree in the winter goes through a phase when it becomes rather, let's say, it becomes all its energy gets drawn inside and goes through a kind of process of annihilation. This happens naturally in the course of the lives of many people who go through a state of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a state in which there is a loss of the sense of identity. And as I said, I quoted Lane, who spoke about the fiasco that, the breakdown that can turn out to be a breakthrough. So the practice consists in learning how to collapse, let us say, break down, accept that breakdown as carrying within it the promise of a new birth, a rebirth. So I would say accept whatever tribulations or hardships you're going through in your life as being part of that process that we all have to go through at a certain moment of breaking down. Now, it is in the course of that breakdown, in the deepest, darkest night, as St. John of the Cross calls it, that the rebirth takes place. There's not only the breakdown of circumstances, but of one's thinking. You know, that St. John of the Cross calls it the dark night of the mind, when all those mental constructs that one had based oneself upon, when it lived with, have broken down. And then there's the dark night of the soul, where one's sense of identity has gone through a terrible collapse. And then in the middle of this night, there is a rebirth. Now, when you're doing the zikr, then you go through that, as you prostrate, you go through that moment of breakdown, and at that moment you exult in an act of glorification. And that is the moment of rebirth, when one is, one's whole being is exalted in an act of glorification. That's one of the things that we need the most in life, is to glorify. Now, that's what most people suffer from, is that one has cut out glorification out of one's life. Participating in the cosmic celebration in the heavens is like all of a sudden remembering the glory that is behind the universe and behind our being, and which is striking through. I often think of ourselves as being like a composition that was composed by an archangel who, an archangel musician or an angel musician who was trying to express his or her bewilderment or glorification, magnification by a piece of music, and we are that piece of music, born out of an act of glorification. Those are the great moments in our lives which Maslow used to call a peak experience. And I think that that is something that we need most in our lives, is to experience a great moment of glory. Most of us suffer from being low-key. And those are the moments, those moments break through at a moment when we have broken down. Okay, now I want to remind you of the different stages in the alchemical process. The first there are 6 stages. The first one is the breakdown. The second one is what happens in the second part of the zikr when one, what they call it the victory of Apollo. That is that a higher consciousness emerges out of our personal consciousness, and this is what happens when we do the kind of meditation that we did this morning, which is called transcendent. This has been very clearly illustrated by Jen Fu, who said, last night I dreamt that I was a butterfly, and this morning I didn't know whether I was a man who dreamt that I was a butterfly, or whether I was a butterfly who's dreaming that he's a man. So this is the clue to that meditation, to a transcendental meditation. A change in one's sense of identity. One thought that one was what one thought one was, and all of a sudden one discovers one's real being. And this happens when one is able to disidentify with one's the transient aspect of one's being, and identify with the eternal aspect of one's being. Well, that's a very important thing to do in your meditation. And to refer again to what I said before, the words of my father, Hazrat Vilayat Khan, one thought that one was a plant, and all of a sudden one discovers that one is the seed of that plant. One is also the seed, and one thought one was just the plant. The seed is the unfurling of the plant. So there's a shift of one's sense of identity from what one thought one was before. Now, the third stage in the alchemical process is experiencing oneself as pure spirit. That means pure spirit, no qualities, beyond qualities, just, let's say, the catalyst of energy. It is called the Immaculate State. Now, this is a state that I have come across amongst some very great beings whom I saw in the Himalayas, I visited in the Himalayas, who become pure spirit. I remember a very old man, must have been, well, they all claim that they're 108 years old because there are 108 beads to the rosary, so they never get old or never get younger, they're all 108. But anyway, I don't know whether he was 108, but his body was crumbling. But he would jog every day. He could hardly walk, but he could jog. He was just pure spirit and bubbling over with life. So it's something that you may experience if you're able to shift your identity, you see, from being the personality that you think you are, and get down to the essence of your being. It's like being the essence of the flowers, for example. The perfume is the essence of the flowers. It's high voltage energy instead of high wattage. Just pure sparkling energy, you see. And the thing about it is that it is immaculate. And you find that amongst people who have overcome a lot of things. One is resentment, of course, but many other things, ambitions and all those things that beset us. And they become just like the snow and ice in the high mountains. It's something that happens to people after having been rather disenchanted with a lot of things in the world. Kind of thing that happens to a hermit. That's the reason why a hermit becomes a hermit. Being rather disgusted by the lies and guile, manipulation, rather disenchanted by the bad tastes of people. There's no accounting for taste sometimes. Sham, by the violence and so on, by the squalor and the selfishness and so on and so forth. So there comes a time when one has a need for truth, and one has a need for solitude, and one has a need for authenticity. And at those moments it is as though one were climbing the mountain and one left the foothills behind where there's lush vegetation, and one climbs up into the rocks and the ice and the snow. And that's where you find some of the greatest rishis. They live up there in the snow. Landscape of the soul. I'd like you to go through that process internally. Just a moment, for a moment of silence in which imagine that you are able to experience resurrection. What the Sufis say is die before death and resurrect now. Don't wait for death, resurrect now. What would it be to resurrect? Imagine that you have collected lots and lots of flowers, and you've extracted the essence of those flowers, and those flowers survive as essence now, and a contingent part of the flowers throw away, but you just keep the essence. Now that's, I would say, the paradigm of resurrection. Imagine that you have extracted the essence of your being, and you identify with the essence of your being. And all the rest is contingent, it's the support, the scaffolding, as is necessary, but the whole purpose of it all was to allow you to get a hold of the essence of your being, and that's what you identify with. And it gives you a sense of being immaculate, purity. Now, in many religions, one speaks about the Holy Spirit that quickens you. Actually, it is an aspect of our own self. Let's say, at some level of our being, we are pure spirit. And when we are aware of being pure spirit, it somehow gives a jolt to our whole being. And it makes us sparkle and vibrate with pure energy. In contrast to, you see how that contrasts with the heavy energy of somebody who keeps on bullying people with their will. And this is a much higher voltage energy, let's say. It's like lightning, and lightning will never brook of any limitation. It will not pass through a cable, it will pass along the cable, but not through the cable. And so it's a kind of energy that cannot be contained or captured. That is your real spirit. And the teaching of the very advanced teaching of the Hystéric schools is never let your spirit be humiliated. And consequently never let your spirit be damped. The spirit is something, of course, that you can't define, but the criterion would be like when you feel that you can keep your head high and you're conscious of the dignity of the human status. In fact, you're conscious of the divinity of your being. And that is the way to overcome one's self-denigration. And my father's answer to this is the greatest pride together with the greatest humility, the aristocracy of the soul together with the democracy of the ego, both together. One has surrendered one's lowest self, but now one identifies with one's higher self. And one accepts that there's constraint, there's limitation in one's lower self, but also one has to accept the splendor of one's higher self. Okay, now we're passing the Cape, and the fourth, fifth, and sixth stages in the alchemical process consist in rebirthing. First of all, starting with the alchemical marriage, betrothal, and then working with the qualities of the personality in a creative way until one affirms one's new being. Well, now we're going to pass through these different stages. And so, first of all, the alchemical betrothal. It consists in rebirthing oneself consciously, that is, going through all the stages that were interwoven into one's present state, consciously instead of unconsciously. It's just like taking the carpet, the tapestry that one is, and taking it apart, all the strands apart, and then reweaving them together in a new pattern. That would be rebirthing. So how do you do that? Okay. Well, now there's a first practice that I'd like to suggest you're doing, and that is as follows. Can you revert your memory back throughout the path of your life, and remember the salient events in your life? Just recall salient events. When, let's say, you could move backwards, for example. Yesterday, a week ago, a month ago, 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, and so on. You can move backwards and remember certain salient events in your life. You know that as one is about to die, one has a kind of overview, like a film. The whole of one's life appears before one like a film, but it's perhaps not like a film. It's rather like a panorama, so that all the events are seen simultaneously. Kind of overview. So could you do that? Instead of just thinking of each event as separate, could you have an overview over all events, all of the most dramatic events, in one take of your consciousness? Okay, now could you observe how your personality has evolved in the course of your life? And now can you see the rapport between the unfoldment of your personality and the events? For example, if I am now what I am, it is due to how I reacted to the events in my life, what I learned from the situations, what came through in me as a consequence of the challenge of the events. Now, of course, you could even recall the events that caused you fear or anger or disappointment, disenchantment, and therefore in some way might have caused some damage to your personality. And then those events that you were able to face and which gave you strength. For example, you were afraid of something and then you faced it, and consequently you become much stronger now than you were before. Okay, now we're going to do the opposite, which is to see the impact of one's being upon the events. For example, if I had been then what I am now, things would not have happened the way they did. And that's where you're seeing the impact of your being on the events. So there's the impact of the events upon your being, and the impact of your being upon the events. As you unfolded, you have had more and more influence on how things were happening in your life. Okay. Now we're going to, the next step this afternoon is going to be to work with creatively with imagery in order to foster the unfoldment of our personality. So I think that at this stage we could do with a break. We'll have a break for a quarter of an hour, and then we'll meet again at say 4:30, and then we have just 1 hour and a half to work with dreams and creative imagination.